Who woke up this morning thankful for the smoke? Yeah, me too a little bit. A friend is visiting, and we were supposed to go to the mountains and bike 100K. And I woke up and it was smoky, and I'm just like, yes, no biking, no torture. I didn't even realize that I didn't want to go. Anyways, so these past few weeks, we've been going through a series about love and romance, right? We've been talking about how wonderful it is, how beautiful it is. And as I was thinking about it, I'm like, yeah, it is, but there's also a really weird aspect of love, right? Love makes weird things happen. It's as if you took a magnet to a compass and the compass goes out of whack. That's what love does sometimes, right? And so here's just some examples, right? The first example, that's your bro disappearing. It's called the no-show bro, right? We've all had friends who've gotten into relationships and they just vanished. They just vanished, like this guy, right? They disappear into thin air. No one can find them for months, for years even. You consider calling the police and putting out a missing persons alert, right? And then when they break up with their girlfriend or boyfriend, they just pop up beside you. And you're just best friends as if nothing happened, as if they haven't abandoned you this whole time, right? And it's like, okay, cool. That's weird. That's weird. The second thing is the cheerleader effect, right? Which I like to call group buff. So this is when you encounter a group of girls or a group of boys, and they just look so cool together, right? You look at the group and you just assume everyone's good looking, everyone's just attractive, you want to impress them, you want to be liked by them, and then the moment you isolate them by themselves, they're kind of average, right? Look at these guys. Just look at one guy. Just average, right? Yeah. A little bit below average, right? Okay. Weird. That's weird. The last one I was thinking of is the halo effect, aka perfection infection, right? And so this is when you're asking a friend, and you're like, hey, they just got into a relationship, and you're like, hey, is there anything you don't like about your new boyfriend, new girlfriend? And they're like, no, honestly, I can't really think of anything at all. We're perfect together, right? He's perfect, she's perfect. And then you kind of look over at that perfect person, and there's literally 20 things you don't like about them already, right? And so love is weird. Love is really, really weird. It makes weird things happen. But in all those scenarios, I think there's a commonality. There's a similarity between all these things. And in that, it's that each one of those people, there's a hope that in some way and somehow we can find a love that fulfills us, right? We want it so badly that we even mold and distort our own view of reality to make it happen, right? But perhaps in the long run, it seems the opposite is more true. People are left disappointed. This love that was supposed to complete us, that was supposed to make us feel like on top of the world for the rest of our lives, it does the complete opposite. It shatters us. It leaves us crippled for years. How can love do such a thing? And so I think it depends on how you define love, right? What do you mean by love? So many people have different ideas of love, right? There is a love that people use for things and food. There's a love that is obsessive, right? Almost seeing people as possessions, right? There's a love that's simply there out of, I don't want to be lonely. There's a love of convenience. And then finally, there's a love that just comes in, sweeping like a tornado, and it just sweeps you off your feet, it twirls you around, and it's the greatest feeling in the world. Only for a moment, and then it spits you out more disappointed than ever. So all these things fail. And so our question today is there a love that satisfies us? And we find in the Bible that there is. There is a love that is more powerful than anything and more precious than anything. And this love can satisfy us. It's actually the experience of God himself in human relationships, right? We'll be focusing on this kind of love for the rest of our time together, and we'll talk about it in a way that applies to all people, all relationships, including romantic relationships. And so we get this Bible passage from Song of Songs today, but before we get there, I just want to give a bit of a recap on what's happening for those who don't know. So in our story, in our plot, it seems like a young woman was sold off by her brothers to a very rich king, our very own King Solomon, right? Who's just girl crazy. He's girl crazy. He has 700 wives, 300 concubines. So that's pretty much King Solomon, right? And so what's a concubine? It's like a second wife, but you get less benefits. And so as a concubine, this woman, she could actually have lived a really, really comfortable life, because King Solomon is like one of the richest kings while Jerusalem was in its most wealthiest era, right? But it would have been completely loveless. But there's another man in this story. Spicy, right? That's so spicy. Okay, there's a poor shepherd, right? Someone that she loved before she was sold off, and she just spends the whole book wishing that they can be together again, trying to get him back or get back to him, but he was nowhere to be found. And so throughout our book, in the face of Solomon's temptations of like wealth and comfort, she chooses over and over again love. She chooses the shepherd. And so our verse that we're looking at is actually near the end of the book, when she's actually finally reunited with the shepherd. And she gives a reflection of what love is like. So let's read. It's in chapter 8, 6 to 7. Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For love is strong as death, jealousy is fierce as the grave, its flashes are flashes of fire, the very flame of the Lord. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. So we get our first point from this. There's a love that is more powerful than anything. Our verse starts off with a woman asking the man to wear her like a seal on the heart and on the arm. And it's kind of like, if I'm being honest, I had no idea what this meant. I'm like, what is a seal, right? Any of these things? And so, what in the world is she asking for? What does the heart and what the arm mean, right? And so we're just going to tear this down. Can I do anything about the mic or higher? Okay. All right. So anyways, according to my research, back then, a seal is actually a tool made of precious stone and metals, and it was used to sign really important documents. So how it would work is that you put like wax, you would melt wax to a document, you grab your seal, and you would press it in, and it was like kind of like a bit of like a fancy equivalent to signatures nowadays, right? And what the seal did was the seal represents them. The seal completely represents them. Through the seal, they would commit their words, they would commit their wealth, they would commit their reputation and their time. And because it was so important, they would actually wear it on like a necklace or on a ring or even on their arm. And so for her to ask him to wear her as a seal on his heart, she wanted him to commit to her at his very core. And so his very inner being belongs to her. She goes further to say, I want to be like a seal on your arms. Arm symbolizes the man's work and actions. And so she's asking for both internal and external commitment to be his own unique treasure, always with him and represents him. Now, as sweet as that sounds, in the context that we're working with, it's actually scandalous, right? It was even illegal, because officially she was the property of King Solomon. And so she was his concubine. For the woman asked the shepherd that to be his and for him to be hers, she was implying that he should steal her from King Solomon. And so he could face the king's wrath, he could even die for this, but she reassures him it's worth it. She says this, for love is strong as death, jealousy is fierce as the grave, its flashes are flashes of fire, the very flame of the Lord. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. And so just to explain some of the symbols there, death and grave were actually often seen as powerful entities back then, right? Something that waits for everyone, that no one can escape. As Thanos would say, it's inevitable, right? And water in their culture symbolized chaos, and floods symbolize destruction. So when we read this, and it's easy to just suspiciously wonder, right? Can love actually be as strong as death? Can it overcome chaos and destruction? And I would say yes. Right? We even see glimpses of these in our everyday lives. I think of my parents. Those aren't my parents. But me and a lot of my friends, actually, we compare our relationships with our parents to a lot of our more westernized friends. And we listen to them say stuff like, yeah, my mom's just like my best friend, and I'm going to go hang out with my dad later. I can't go with you. And it's like, I can't even imagine what that's like, right? Just don't have that, right? There are a lot of different ways to say love in Vietnamese, depending on like who you are compared to in relevance to the person. I don't even know what it's supposed to sound like if a parent says it to a kid. Like, yeah, I've like just never heard. I just don't know it, right? So I was just basing it off of casual and verbal interactions. It's easy to conclude that my parents don't have this death and chaos defeating love, and I would be completely wrong to say that. I'm a parent now, and keeping up with the mundane, repetitive things in life for my kids is probably one of the hardest things I've ever done, right? It's like a task that can just never be completed, and no one sees it, no one appreciates it, right? And I think my mom, and she has sacrificed so much to be able to do that for me and my brothers for decades. Cook, clean, research those like sketchy Facebook doctors to see what's good for her kids. She loves me in a way that keeps me alive, healthy, thriving. It overcomes death. For my dad, in his love for his family, escaping war-torn Vietnam costed him everything. Everything, right? Separating from his family for like 7 years, in prison for 2 of them, refugee camp for most of it, and yet that was a love that actually might have overcome death, at least temporarily. For the ones that he loved, he did that. And so after knowing that, I don't really care if he doesn't say, I love you. He screams it through his life. And so that's a glimpse of amazing love, but I think we need to make note of where it comes from, right? So in our passage, it says that it's the flame of the Lord, right? The flame of the Lord. Love is the flame of the Lord. And so love actually comes from God himself. The Bible says that God is love, and the Bible says that we are made in his image. So if you follow it logically, it just means that any human love is a reflection of God. Though some reflections are cloudier and blurrier and distorted than others. But God's love for us isn't just as strong as death. We see with Jesus and the cross that if anything, God's love for us is stronger than death and grave. And so this is the love that the woman followed, and it led her to do what was right and good. And this is the kind of love that we can follow in our everyday relationships, especially the more important ones like marriage. The love of God himself. I genuinely believe that as our reflection of love looks more and more like God, we will thrive more and more in our relationships. We can have relationships to the fullest. And so how do we experience this kind of love? I think to reflect God accurately, we need to know what he looks like. And so lucky for us, we actually have a perfect representation of God in the person of Jesus, right? And so I think the first thing we can do to actually experience this is to spend time pondering and reflecting about Jesus. His birth and what that fulfilled. His life and what he models. His death and what he sacrificed. His resurrection and what he overcame. His ascension and what he promises. When we are intentional about studying Jesus, we are more able to feel the awe and weight of God's love for us. A love that gave up everything so that it can overcome anything. But it doesn't just stop with imagination, right? Just like today's idea about the heart and the arms, it moves into action, internal and external. So let yourself be consumed and moved by God's love so that it just doesn't stop with a mental reflection, but it overflows in everyday life. To live out a love that defeats death, it's not like you just like camp out at a cemetery and try to raise the dead, right? It doesn't work that way. I often think of death as many kinds, right? It shows itself in many kinds. There are kind of a lot of types of death, right? Even while people are alive. And so sickness, that's a kind of death. Social isolation, toxic worldviews, narratives, injustices and corruption, even lack of life purpose and meaningless pursuits, right? I think these are all kinds of deaths and chaos. We overcome their effects when we love like God, right? We have the power and perhaps even the responsibility to love God and sacrifice in a way that brings people out of these kinds of deaths and towards thriving life. If you don't know where to start, I honestly think the best start is just to offer yourself as a listening ear. That does wonders for a lot of these. When you love this way, it will lead you to broken people. It will lead you to places that are uncomfortable, but also lead you to the most incredibly deep relationships that you will be able to find. Meaningful relationships in the form of friendships, co-workers, co-heirs in Christ, families, and even a spouse, maybe. And so what more could you want? This leads us to our second point. Our second point is that there is a love more precious than anything. And so our Bible verse here is the second half of verse 7. If a man offered for love all the wealth of his house, he would be utterly despised. It's just saying it's not enough. All the wealth that you can give up is just not enough for the love. And so this seems actually to be the core idea of the book. There's a love out there that's so precious, it's worth more than all of Solomon's wealth. And he was ridiculously wealthy, right? The pursuit of things like wealth and comfort, that was normal back then, just as it is now. And yet this book makes a bold claim that everything pales in comparison to love. I hear this situation come up kind of often. I know like a couple, and they seem to be a really good fit. Like they get along, they have a good friendship, they're aiming for the same things, I thought at least. And then out of nowhere, they would break up after like years. And this happened, I know at least like 3 couples like this. And I'm like, why? What happened? Like, was there an affair? Did you find out like a really terrible secret about your partner? And then the reason was often like, oh no, like the girl, the guy wanted to really take the next step, to really commit to the other person, to like do life together, and they got rejected, right? They just broke up. I don't know where I am. Okay, there I am. Yeah, they wanted to settle down, and so the other person backs out, and that just makes no sense to me. It's like, oh, yeah, my partner wants to like fully commit to me and do life together, be there for me, do the best and the worst of times. That's such a deal breaker, and I'm just like, what more do you want, right? What more do you want other than that? What makes it worse is what they end up choosing instead, right? And I didn't ask them if they chose this, but this is just like watching their Instagram stories or whatever. But they seem to choose instead are like fleeting things, like climbing career ladders, or traveling, or the nightlife, temporary flings. And I guess I'm like, sure, yeah, you do you, but from my perspective, and it seems judgy, but I'm like, it doesn't seem like a good trade. It seems like a bad trade. And so in the book of Song of Songs, it's pretty cool. So there's a contrast between like urban, like every time King Solomon came up, he would talk about like things like money and palaces and even fashion, right? The way he dresses. And it's like very worldly. And then every time the shepherd came up, it was all about nature, right? It was all about like trees and flowers and animals and stuff. And I think that shows something actually quite profound about the reality of our world, right? The most valuable things in life are not so much things at all. Even though we get fixated on them, it's not the house or the car that you work so hard for that is most precious. No, it's often the thing that is most... Oh, can we go back a slide? Sorry. It's often the thing that is most readily available to us that matters the most. Relationships that are just ripe for the picking there. And so technically, relationships are not even worth any money at all. And yet, I wouldn't trade some of my relationships for millions of dollars. What does that say about the preciousness of love? What we have with people is often going to be the most important thing in life. And if it's the most important thing in life, then we ought to live like that's true. But if we're being honest, we don't. It's kind of like this. I remember I picked up the game MapleStory with my friends. And it was for my friends. It was like to do things together, to be friends. And then what ended up happening was I got kind of addicted to MapleStory, right? And so I would like play at like 2 to 4 a.m. because that's like when the double experience came up. And then my friends would ask me to hang out, and I'm like, no, I can't. I gotta play MapleStory, right? And it's just like, it doesn't make sense. If the relationships were the most important thing, I'm totally screwing up my priorities. And it's kind of like that. If we truly know the value of our relationships, then we need to pursue love no matter what stage of life you're in. And once you have it, and once you're aware of it, do what you can to protect it and to cultivate it. In the past, I've been in relationships where my partner was like not very faithful, right? And so I just figured, I'm like, okay, this probably hurts me down the road. I'll probably like have like trust issues, whatever, right? And yet with Christine, I've never had trust issues, right? I've never felt that kind of mistrust. And I often joke with her. I'm like, well, you know, like no one wants you, so what would I have to be worried about, right? But I know, terrible. But if I'm being really honest, the reality is that she very intentionally sets up boundaries to protect our marriage. Like with other guys, for example, she just doesn't hang out with them. She doesn't really engage in like really deep talks with them. And even though initially I did not agree with her, I'm like, no, like girls and guys can be friends. They can just be like platonic and whatever, right? It's the same. I'm starting to see the immense value of her choices because she is committed to protecting our marriage, and she's willing to go to extreme measures for it as well. And so I've slowly followed her example throughout the years, and I realized it's more than just people, right? There's time too, there's investment too. There are a few times where I cut out a slot for her and the family, and I'm just sitting there like dead because I'm just so exhausted from like the past week. And she's like, it's as if you're not here. I'm like, that makes sense. Like I'm not really here. I'm not even thinking about the family, right? So you can go beyond just boundaries with other people. Something I read recently that's really shifting my view of helping people actually is that when you say yes to someone, automatically you are saying no to someone else, right? When you're spending your time, when you're going out of your way to help someone, you're saying no to other things, right? And for me, that something I'm saying no to is often my family. It's Christine and the boys. And I want to change that, right? To protect my most precious relationships. And so set up boundaries, whether that's relational, whether that's time with your schedule. Be intentional. Set up boundaries, protect your time with your loved ones. And so where love is precious to you, whether that's in friendships or siblings or parents, family, your own kids, protect it. Prioritize it. Do whatever you can to make it thrive. And so just to recap today's message, there's a love that can satisfy us. And it's actually when we allow God's love to be the source of all our loves and our relationships. This love is powerful. It's enough to defeat death and chaos even. So let's love people in a way that combats all these kinds of deaths that we face. The second point is that love is precious, more so than most things we earn for ourselves. So let's do what we can to protect it and to cultivate it.